Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Concord Museum. I'm Lisa Krasner, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director, and I'm delighted to welcome both our in-person and virtual audiences. We do have a number of people watching online tonight. So we're honored to present a conversation tonight between Megan Marshall and John Kagg as they discuss Marshall's latest book, Afterlives, on biography and the mysteries of the human heart, a collection of essays blending memoir and biography, her lifelong pursuit to, as she writes, learn what I could from others, how to live, how not to live, what it means to live. Megan Marshall is a leading voice in American literary history and biography. Her books include The Peabody Sisters, which won multiple awards and was a Pulitzer finalist, Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, which won the Pulitzer Prize in biography, and Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast, an innovative blend of biography and memoir. Her essays and criticism appear in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times Book Review, and more. In 2022, she received the Bio Award, the highest honor from the Biographers International Organization. Marshall has held prestigious fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. She teaches nonfiction writing and archival research in the MFA program at Emerson College, where she was named the first Charles Wesley Emerson College professor. Joining her is John Kagg, a philosopher and professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Kagg specializes in American philosophy and the examined life. He's the author of many acclaimed books, including Sick Souls, Healthy Minds, How William James Can Save Your Life, American Philosophy, A Love Story, Hiking with Nietzsche, On Becoming Who You Are, and American Bloods, The Untamed Dynasty That Shaped a Nation. His writing has been widely published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Harper's Magazine, and more. Professor Kagg is co-founder of Rebind, an AI-native publishing company, which will be coming back here to the Concord Museum in May to discuss with us in another forum. So it is my great privilege to have them both with us tonight, and please join me in welcoming Megan Marshall and John Kagg.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to read just a little bit from one of the essays, and then we'll have our conversation. But I want to thank the Concord Museum for having us here. I want to thank Allison Schilling and Lisa Krasner for hosting, and the Concord Bookshop. Did the Concord Bookshop? They're here. Yay! Look at that. And I also really want to thank the community of Concord, which is provides such warmth to all of us in a time when we need that, a community that's based around literature, history, and a history of progressivism that we need to remind ourselves of. We never forget here. And also welcome to the online viewers who are part of that community too. And John Kagg, who I have quizzed a number of times in similar settings, but this is a kind of turnabout, so we'll see how that goes. The name of the book, Afterlives, has several meanings. The most obvious one, and the reason it's two words, Afterlives, is it's the book that I wrote after writing 3 big biographies after those lives. And it was 2017 when I finished and published the biography of Elizabeth Bishop. It was a time like now when we had an erratic new president and nobody knew what was happening. I found it very disorienting as a writer, and it took quite a while to figure out where I was going to position myself going forward. And I also kind of wanted to get out from under these massive deadlines for massive biographies. So I began the first of these essays, and that's the one I'm going to read a bit from. In 2018, as I realized that we were coming up on the 100th anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I, and I'd had in back closets letters that my grandfather, my Marshall grandfather, had written home from Paris, where he had been stationed, and I'd never read them, and I didn't know what I'd find. All I knew was I didn't even know my grandfather that well. He was dim and distant at the time that I knew him, and I kind of imagined I would find that he'd suffered shell shock or something. And I proposed this article to the New Yorker they were excited about that. But then I began reading the letters, and that wasn't the story at all. It was really something more of a love story, because he magically was able to bring his new young wife. I mean, most post-war marriage or pre-wartime marriages were very rapidly made, and then you find the couples having to be separated during the war. But no, they went to Paris together. So that's what I found out. But here's the beginning, and it's called The Second Man in the Front Row, after a photograph that when you see in the book, each essay has a photograph facing it, and you'll hear about the photograph in the beginning. And I guess I have to say, practicing reading this for you, I thought how poignant it is that we seem on the brink of a troubling shift in global politics, which was somewhat the case back then. It's an iconic photo, easily found on websites devoted to World War I, first sent out to newspapers in 1917 with the caption, "Funeral of the First American Soldier Killed in Battle in France." In a cemetery in the small village of Berthélemont, a French chaplain reads the funeral service as a dozen soldiers stand in formation, eyes trained on the casket poised above the grave, a mound of fresh earth beside it. The sky is gray. A barren wood lines the horizon. One could mark the start of what's come to be called the American century here. It's possible to look back and trace a line from that moment straight to the United States' dominance in world politics at the mid-20th century and beyond. I look at the photo and see something else. My grandfather, Joe Marshall, standing on the right, the second man in the front row, as he put it in a letter home to his parents. Joe was wearing a doughboy helmet, and he points out in the letter what looks to be a fur collar. Only the back of his head is visible, and the collar, he explains, is actually the khaki sweater my grandmother, Elizabeth Metcalf Marshall, his bride of 6 months, knitted for his 28th birthday, just a few weeks before. My grandfather had not planned to be in the photograph. His face is turned toward the burial, away from the camera. But as the deputy press officer in charge of photography and film for the American Expeditionary Forces, he'd set up the shot and later, from his office in Paris, posted the image around the globe. I knew none of this until, as the centennial of the armistice that ended World War I approached, I decided to look through several boxes of family letters and photographs to learn what I could of my grandparents' war experience. My grandfather was a retired life insurance salesman in his 70s when I knew him best, if I knew him at all. He was tall and thin, in memory a blur of gray hair, gray wool cardigans and trousers. When I was growing up in Southern California in the 1960s, my family of 5 would join my grandparents, who lived one town over, for dinners on Sundays and holidays. My grandfather maintained a nearly mute formality, speaking more words in French, sotto voce, with my grandmother than in English. My grandparents had lived in Paris through the war. Their first child, my Uncle Joe Jr., had been born there. That much I knew. There were hints of an adventurous life before the war. The small mahogany yo-yo, for instance, which my older brother, younger sister, and I took turns playing with after dinner, and which my father said was the first yo-yo to reach America. I think it could be. It was brought back by my grandfather from the Philippines in 1915. If you looked this up, as I did, that's when, around the time that yo-yos were introduced from the Philippines, and my grandfather just wasn't the one to do it. My father told me, too, about a poem that his father recited to his children every night at bedtime. A child is speaking. Day by day, I float my paper boats one by one down the running stream, it went. In big black letters, I write my name on them and the name of the village where I live. I hope that someone in some strange land will find them and know who I am. It was written by the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, who received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913. My grandfather had met him, my father said, at Tagore's ashram outside Kolkata. These few facts didn't square with the silent elderly gentleman at the head of the dinner table, forgotten by everyone but my grandmother, a children's librarian, who coaxed his appetite with real butter for his white bread and mint jelly for his slice of lamb. And in some ways, the letters I read half a century later only deepened the mystery, but they also brought to life the man in the photograph and reminded me how much we lose when we turn away from the past. So, my bit. Thanks. Here we go. Thank you for your gallantry here.
It's a small stage.
I was going to say, can you hear me all right with this? That aside from the afterlives, meaning there's also a way in which I was discovering how the subjects that I wrote about had a kind of afterlife in my life. They never really leave. And then there are the people like my grandfather who I'm kind of giving an afterlife to by writing about them.
Before I start quizzing you, I'm going to say just a couple of words about this collection. Dwight Garner in the New York Times said that Megan is in the first class of biographers, and I would say in my experience with you, Megan, over the last 10 years, you're in the first class of people that I've ever encountered. And I would say that being in the first class of academics and in the first class of kind, generous, thoughtful, and earnest people, sometimes those Venn diagrams don't particularly, but in Megan's case, it certainly does. What I'd like to sort of start with a question is about the relationship between the personal and the historic, and what it was like for you to sort of move into a more personal mode of writing, which we find in this collection.
Oh, well, that's a good and a hard question in a way. I think I had begun doing this a bit in my biography of Elizabeth Bishop. She had been my professor, so there's a kind of narrative line that runs subterraneanly, perhaps, alongside of Elizabeth Bishop's own life. And I had found a great kind of liberation in writing more freely that way and in drawing on my own memories and making it shape out of my own experience. I also felt, and this is maybe kind of a reason that I became a biographer, that we are all living in history, and we are living as history is being made, and it's not something we often think about, although we might be thinking about that right now. And I wanted to explore that sense. So I'm writing personally, but it's also, and all of the essays are historical in a sense, and they're all derived from manuscripts or objects from the past that I'm kind of trying to see my own experience or my grandparents' experience through. I guess, I think it's been said that biographers always have some kind, and I write about this too, a sort of hidden connection with their subjects. And that's certainly true for me. There were reasons that I chose the Peabody sisters, that I chose Margaret Fuller or Elizabeth Bishop to write about. But I think many people who are drawn to writing have some kind of hidden hurt or maybe more than one that drives them to want to say something, to leave a mark on the world. To say, yes, I'm here. And I think it's that impulse that's kind of stepping out from behind the biography finally to say, this is my life, or my people, and how I got here.
The first couple lines from the collection go, dead men tell no tales, but dead women do. At least they do to me. Or actually, it's a hyphen, it's an M dash to me. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about why you've been fascinated by women's lives and why dead women tell tales, especially to you.
Well, it sounded good. But I think, that theme actually runs through the whole book. And the very last essay is called Left-Handed. It's about the women in my family. So I was growing up, both my grandmothers were left-handed, my mother was left-handed, her sister-in-law, my aunt were left-handed. Anyway, that is an essay that becomes an essay about why it is that I'm interested in women's lives and the kind of complications that they experience. And so the left-handedness becomes a sort of metaphor for that, for a kind of disability that women experience just being in the patriarchy. And so, yes, why do women speak to me? Well, yes, I've just always been fascinated by women's lives. I could not, one of my great friends in Biography is Stacy Schiff, and I often say to her, how do you write about these men? I can't do that. I couldn't do that. It's just, that's not I don't have anything against men, but it's just, I don't feel I have any special insight. Although I did at one point think I would like to write the biography of John Updike. It's been done, but because I think he's like Nathaniel Hawthorne, a kind of domestic writer, and he does show up in this book a bit too. So I got to write a bit about him. But yeah, women, I was drawn to biography through writing about women's contemporary lives, and I began to think, let's look at the history of this and see how we got where we are.
In that essay, Left-Handed, that was excerpted in the New Yorker.
Yes.
And it struck me that it is principally about your mother.
Right. Whose self-portrait is on the cover of the book. She was an artist, and that's a lot of what's explored in that essay.
And I was wondering if you could sort of say what it was like to write about the people that you have been so close to, including your mother.
Well, it's been very restorative, and it's developed a connection. I'm sure many of us here have lost a parent or both parents or a spouse or a child. And you know that after the initial shock, you begin to build a new relationship with this person. And so writing about my mother, to whom I was actually not close, she died at 68, and I was in my late 30s. There wasn't time to kind of work out the wounds that had kept us apart. So I don't think you'd know from reading this essay that we hadn't been close. And so it was very much a way of expressing my affection for her and coming to know her in a way I hadn't known her before. She kept the letters that she and her mother exchanged over a lifetime, their lifetimes, every week. And I happen to know that they were not close, actually, but she was writing every week to her mother and telling her lots of things that I was kind of surprised to say, because as you'll find out in the Left-Handed essay, that my grandmother had very much wanted to have a son, and she did luckily have a son, the first child, and then my mother, and the son really was much more important to my grandmother. So anyway, it's been very healing, and similarly, there's another one of the essays is about time I spent in Kyoto. It's about, but with reverberations, that time recurred to me during the pandemic when I was suddenly alone. My partner of 15 years had died just before the pandemic, and it was also very healing and restorative to write about him and the period of his dying that is brought up in that essay.
These personal essays are unique in the sense that they sort of direct us back to the past, but then they encourage us to learn something from the past in a particular way. And I was wondering if you could take us through a couple poignant moments where you think, oh, this is a lesson for today, or...
Ooh, that's interesting. Well, I guess I would say overall there's the lesson that, it's often said the past is never dead, it's not even past. Well, but this is a further iteration of that, in that you can connect and you can be buoyed up by the past and learn things and feel the feelings that you didn't allow yourself when you were younger and immersed in whatever drama might have, occluded things. but lessons. One lesson, one of the essays I know you want to talk about is called These Useless Things, and it's about my coming to understand the value of objects in writing history. And we have Ivan Gaskell, who's the master of this field here, but I made my way through it as best I could. And I guess in that case, I learned as a writer about people, biography, that I had kind of not looked at. I've been looking at the words. I was so lucky to have written about subjects who kept diaries and letters, and all their feelings were there, and whole scenes I could write from these letters. But the objects I hadn't paid so much attention to. And this essay kind of takes you again from things that mattered to me. My father's ice pick, which I still have. It has a wine cork on the end of it, so it's not too scary to have on my windowsill. And it goes all the way through, and I won't tell you how we end up, but we end up at the Peabody sisters' writing desk that was given to them in 1826 by their students. And I wanted to read a little passage from that, but shall I do that, or did you want to say? Okay.
Please do.
This is on the way, and this is also where John Updike comes in, because he wrote, I realized as I was reading with a friend the Rabbit novels during the pandemic, the ice plant, the defunct ice plant keeps coming back in each of these novels, and ice boxes, and then, of course, Thoreau comes in. But before we get there, this is about my, and there is a kind of looking back and a nostalgia and a mourning for some of these in these essays, and here's, I think this is kind of a mourning, but also a celebration of childhood pleasures before you even begin to read, which, of course, the greatest pleasure is to read, but anyway. I don't remember living through the developmental stage at which young children explore the world by putting things in their mouths. But it must have been soon after that I discovered the joy of sorting, piling up, forming patterns on the carpet with the objects no longer useful or just waiting to be used that my parents offered me for play. There was the plain cedar button box with its exposed corner joinery I still have, and open now after years, stowed on a bookshelf next to my mother's college texts, music, art history, botany, emblems of her rise to the educated class. To see what's inside. On top, a cluster of yellowing cards bearing sets of 3, 6, 8 buttons of varied sizes and colors from La Mode, choice of smart women for more than 90 years. La Chic, Jewel Tone, Pacific, True Craft, marked with prices ranging from 10 to 59 cents. Underneath, a rainbow of discs, the small C I remember sliding my hands into. I find tiny mother-of-pearl stars and fish, faux brass buttons with eagles and anchors, woven leather buttons that remind me of the hooded camel hair car coat I had in 7th grade and rarely took off, my shelter from high-stress social life in junior high. Sunk to the bottom, a scattering of what appear to be brown and black coffee beans affixed to metal hooks, shoe buttons from a distant age. A crumpled plastic baggie surfaces with the intricate turquoise knots and looped fasteners of the faded Chinese housecoat my mother wore all the years of my childhood as her art-making smock. Why had she saved them when the fabric gave out? Because she had a button box, which became mine after her death 3 decades in the past. What I no longer possess is more vivid still, the cardboard box of ceramic tile samples in muted earth tones, cool to the touch, that I laid out as doll-sized walkways or floors of imaginary rooms on the gray living room rug. The Japanese box, whose inlaid rustic scenery split into 2 and then 4 cantilevered compartments, opening out to reveal bumpy beads of confetti-colored Murano glass and pale carved bone, smooth lozenges of amber, gleaming pink crystal globes with miniature explosions inside, my grandmother's broken jewelry. I never thought of the kitchens or bathrooms the tiles might have lined, the necklaces from which the beads had come unstrung. These useless things had no past or future. They were simply mine to handle and admire, in a way, to love.
It strikes me as you're reading Megan's collection, this collection, you get the feeling that you're reading something like W.S. Merwin's poetry. It feels sort of poetic, and it reminds me that if you read the Elizabeth Bishop book, you were quite a talented poet, and you still are, obviously. And I was wondering if you could talk about the way that this collection deviates in terms of style of writing from some of your other work, but also the way that poetry, the way that poetry might function in the reading of it.
There is a fair amount of poetry in it. There's one of the essays that I'm most happy having finally been able to write is about growing up in Pasadena alongside my high school classmate Jonathan Jackson, the younger brother of George Jackson, who wrote the Prison Letters, Soledad brother. And Jonathan, the year before our senior year, had acquired guns that belonged to Angela Davis, held up a courtroom in Marin County, and he was killed. The judge was killed. It was a misguided effort to rescue his brother. He was just 17 and the first classmate of mine to die. And in writing about that, I did a lot of research in Pasadena, Altadena as well, and we've been thinking about Pasadena and Altadena because of the fires lately. That's where my grandparents had their house, and my father grew up in Altadena. But I had been reading Octavia Butler by chance, and her wonderful poem Earthseed comes into the book as well, which I think I wasn't able, because her estate is complicated and we could never contact her estate to get permission, but I'll just read the poem Earthseed, which many of you probably know. All that you touch, you change. This is just part of the poem even, but I couldn't even use this much. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change, which is a very, much in line with the Buddhist poet Kamo no Chume, who I wrote about in the second to last essay, which is the essay about Kyoto, and one of my enterprises on my semester at Kyoto University was to track down Kamo no Chume's, the replica of his hut, which is, as he was, people sometimes think of him as the Thoreau of Japan. He had retired into the woods and had a hut that was even more portable than our Henry's, and there's a replica of it on the grounds of a shrine, and I went up also to find the site. But his poetry is laced through it as a kind of guide to me, and he wrote a great deal about natural disasters, and including, as I realized while I was writing this, also about a great plague that took many lives. So his poetry about that really led me through the time in Kyoto and then the time later during the pandemic. I think, I took classes in poetry, including with Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell, and what I learned there was that every word matters. And I have written even my prose in that way, and trying to get it to say what I mean to say, and to say it as best I can. And with that in mind, there was something I did want to say to this audience in particular. Aside from getting the right words, I like to get the facts right, and I have a confession to make that there is an error in this book about the inscription on Una Hawthorne's gravestone up there in Sleepy Hollow. And I had this nightmare that after reading about these dead women who are telling me their tales, one of them is Una Hawthorne, you're going to go up there and look at the stone and see that I got it wrong. So I want to tell you, anyone who's here and buys a book here, I'll give you my little errata slip. It's going to, I didn't find this out in time to fix it for the book. It's correct. It'll be correct in the e-book soon and whenever they print some more. So buy lots of books so we can print some more and get this right. But I'll tell you also, this is what I find in writing, that the facts, the real story always makes it better, and I actually prefer this passage that I came up with to substitute for the incorrect one. So you'll be happy that I'm giving this to you. But what I was going to say, I happen to be reading the daughter of Justin Kaplan. I don't know if you're familiar with his biographies of Mark Twain and Walt Whitman. He was a mentor and guiding light when I started off on the Peabody Sisters in the 80s. Mark Twain won the Pulitzer. Both Mark Twain and Walt Whitman won the National Book Award. He's a very generous man, and his daughter Hester, who's a novelist, has written a memoir of growing up with her father. And one of the stories she tells is that late in his life he started teaching in an MFA program, and he was just very disturbed with the level of the writing of the students. And he was, one thing he said, they can't even spell T-shirt correctly. Now, how do you spell T-shirt? So she said to him, and this is in her manuscript, the book will be out in the fall, she says, did it really matter that much? And what Justin Kaplan says is, and I believe this, getting it right is the only thing that matters. So I'm sorry about the mistake in my book.
I was wondering if you might take us a little deeper into that essay, the Hawthorne essay.
Yeah, well...
since we are in Concord.
Yes, I think you would want to know. So shortly after the Peabody Sisters came out, I was contacted by the Sisters of the Rosary Hill Home, an order of nuns founded by Rose Hawthorne, the youngest of the Sophia and Nathaniel Hawthorne's children, and they were organizing to have the remains of Sophia and the oldest of the Hawthorne children, Una Hawthorne, returned from London up to Sleepy Hollow, and now that's where they are. I had gone to visit these graves in Kensal Green in London and admired them, and there was this, hawthorn tree that I guess probably Una had planted, and that was in bloom and beautiful when I saw it in 1989, something like that. But this was 2006, and they said, would you like to? They kind of wanted to draw me into this as a way of drawing attention to Rose in particular, who's been, she's up to be canonized, and they would like that to happen. So, and probably it should or will happen. Anyway, so part of this was the remains were exhumed, and before the day in June, I guess, or July, it's in there, that they were brought to Concord. They were first brought to the Rosary Hill Home in Hawthorne, New York, and the Sister Mary Joseph called me and she said, would you like to be there? Well, I'd like to be there when they come, I said, well, I guess so, And so I went down there along with Allison Deming, one of the descendants of the Hawthorne family, who's a wonderful poet and essayist, and they took us into a little room and with this small coffin, a child-sized coffin, and left us alone with it. And Sister Mary Joseph says, well, you could look in the coffin if you'd like. So I deferred to Allison, because it's not my relatives, and she opened it. And I think I'm not going to tell you what I found, but it revived my fascination, my puzzling over Una Hawthorne's early death at 33. And led me on this kind of wild goose chase, studying again what Hawthorne had written about Little Pearl and the Scarlet Letter, who was very much modeled on his daughter, Una, who was around that age at the same time. Her behavior, you can just see that, and trying to make some sense of her life and mull over, what it is, the way it is that biographers' subjects hang on to them and never really leave.
We were talking about, we were speaking on the phone yesterday, and you said not all of the essays are incredibly happy. And throughout the book, there is throughout the collection, there is a certain type of bittersweetness to many of the essays. And I was wondering if you could say something about that bittersweetness, or about...
First, you have to tell me, is it okay?
I think it's more than okay. I think it's an incredibly important sentiment to actually experience. especially today. And I was wondering, since it is public, I mean, writers write so they're read.
Yeah.
And you must know that that type of sentiment is expressed. And so I'm wondering what you think of that.
Well, you know, I said that I even in the Useless Things essay, I talk about becoming deeply a reader, and how, you know, when I read books that were illustrated, I didn't even want to see the pictures because I wanted, you know, my own images. But the books I most loved made me cry. And that's what made me want to be a writer. That I thought, if I could be someone who could move people to tears in my writing, that seemed to me the highest calling in life. I can't tell you why. It's just, you know, there was emotion, I guess, maybe if you read my story of my life in this book, there were emotions that I couldn't express in, you know, to the people to whom they might better have been expressed. And so crying over Sarah Cruz's father's death and, you know, the magic comes. Those were very important moments to me in reading. And I have to say, people do tell me they cry at the ends of all of my books. And they cried a number of times in this book, they will say, some of them, if you're a crier. And then that takes me back to that child I was who's, you know, it wasn't an ambition. It just seemed to me it would be a good that I could bring to the world in some way.
When I cry at the end of your Fuller book, it's different than me choking up over the way that you tell the history of your family.
Oh.
And it's interesting that because it reminds me of the way that all of our families probably deserve to be cried over in one way or another. And since we spent a little bit of time talking about your mother, I'd like to just ask you, in These Useless Things, one of the sentences that really got me was right at the beginning, second page of the essay. You say
Should
that.
We read it?
Yeah. Can I? You
I can
read
find it. Because it was right by the other one that I read. So
page 90.
Yeah. Do you want to read it? Shall I read it?
You read it,
Okay.
but it's it's from They May Never See.
Yeah. So I'm talking about the ice pick that I've kept all these years that I figure had belonged to my father, and how my children would probably not much appreciate it because they didn't ever see my father use it. They may never have seen an ice pick in anyone's hands, except perhaps at a winter carnival featuring ice sculptures. Certainly they never saw this one in my father's hands, the same ones that taught me on his good days when I was a child how to hold a hammer and strike a nail, how to draw a saw evenly across a board, how to row a boat, that sometimes disappeared inside a black cloth sack to unload exposed film from a camera by feel.
And what catches me is on his good days,
Yeah.
which is an expression that caught me, and it's ambiguous about what his good days meant.
It follows from the previous one about Jonathan Jackson, which is also about my growing up, and has a little more material about how we landed in Pasadena, my father's hometown, which he had expected to leave, and but was failing in work in various ways, and so that's why I actually added that phrase in when I gathered the collection together, because I realized this essay about things and about my father kind of seemed like, out of the blue, suddenly my father's kind of a heroic almost, or at least capable, and that after reading about him in the previous one, people might have thought, wait a minute, so I added that, and I'm glad, it was important anyway. But I do remember his hands doing all of those things. And later, carrying the block of ice up the mountainside to our little cabin. And I'm trying to think. I don't know if I can find this, but I'm writing about the ice pick all this time. This dangerous weapon that's blunted by the cork, and there's a certain point where, I didn't even really realize as I was writing it how symbolic that the thing itself is of my father. Ivan, these things happen all the time when people think about objects. They become the person. The danger that's blunted by the wine cork, and of course he was an alcoholic.
Do you think that do you have any advice? So I have tried to write personally or write personal essays, and I was wondering, do you have any advice? And I think all of us, and many of us in one way or another, when we write personally. Either we write in journals or in marginalia, or we write for ourselves or for our loved ones. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or advice, specifically advice about writing personally, or writing in this mode.
It's interesting you bring that up. All writing is good. All writing should be done. But I was telling someone, kind of a senior person and a person with an academic career, that I was writing these essays. This was, a while ago, maybe a year ago. I said, this is what I'm working on. A book's coming out with my essays about kind of my family, And he said, well, that's all very well and good, but is anyone going to read them? And, of course, that's the thought that I had. And I felt, this is somebody I thought was going to be kind of supportive of me. And I, was shocked and, in fact, thought, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. But he said the same thing to me more recently when the book had come out, and he was looking at it there, kind of astonished. And what he said was that he had written he didn't say this the first time, he'd written his memoirs for his children and had them printed up privately. And even then they didn't read them, I think, or they didn't necessarily care in the way he thought they might. So I don't know. I'm glad that he wrote I have my grandfather's journals and letters and things like that. I didn't read them while he was alive, but I'm so glad to have them now. And they made this book, So maybe one day one of his grandchildren will take what he wrote and write something, more shaped and with more perspective than he was able to bring to his own life.
Do you think that so two things. One is, in your Elizabeth Bishop book, you do bring yourself into the story. Mm-hmm. And in the reviews afterward, which I thought were very unjust, you were criticized for doing so.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk about what it is to share your personal stories as a woman versus men oftentimes feel perfectly capable to share their personal stories.
Yeah, I think, at the time that happened, and John very kindly wrote something about this for LitHub in support of me, there did happen to be sort of a rash of somewhat similar books by men where they were applauded for this. But I've thought about that since. I think a lot of it had to do with the expectation of me as a biographer. I was doing something that biographers don't do. And people had the same Dwight Garner, who said, I'm at the front rank of American biography. In his review of the Fuller book, said, she's lost it here with the Bishop book, and it was very nasty. But I think it's because it wasn't the book he was expecting to read, and it's harder, or it's a different experience reading the Elizabeth Bishop book than any normal biography. And my editor had kindly said, will biography ever be written the same way again after this book? We thought I was onto something, and maybe I was, but I think this still is the case. The Times review of this book was very favorable, spoke a great deal about the contents, which in an interesting way, but still you could tell this reviewer is kind of struggling to figure what's she doing here? So I think it's a kind of a category shift that reviewers have trouble with, but that I think readers don't, and readers are very happy to read this. And I've been, exploring this whole. There's a website I think called Memoirland, and the editor of that interviewed me, and I got so many letters from people saying, "I read your interview in Memoirland," and I had never heard myself of Memoirland. So go to Memoirland yourselves, not to read about me, just to be there, I think. So I wonder if we should, is it time for some questions?
Let's do it.
So, yeah. We're going to have a mic, so. Thanks for all your questions, John. I think he did a good job of switching the roles.
Absolutely. Thanks, Megan, for being here. Kind of following on your question, I'm thinking that you did refer to, I think, grandfather letters as one source, but I'm really interested because it's so different. And I'm wondering if you keep a diary, or if you kept a diary as a child in order to access, or did you just recollect and make notes? I'm just fascinated with that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's really memory, and sometimes these things, the useless things, feeling those buttons reminded me of the jewelry, which I have to tell you, I did find that Japanese box after the book was done. It was in the back of a closet. It was driving me nuts that I couldn't find it. But anyway, I seem to have a pretty good memory, although I also really do a lot of, especially the essay about Jonathan Jackson. I spoke to classmates. I learned so much more about Pasadena from my friends who had stayed there or had grown up and had different lives than I had. So I do a lot of interviewing as well and reading. I read lots of things about things, notions of things. But how do you? The letters were absolutely fabulous that my parents and grandparents had saved, and I'm so lucky that they survived. I actually had a divorce, and I had to leave the big house where all these things were sitting in the back closets, and I was fortunate that Harvard would take my grandfather's letters. So actually I was reading those letters in the Harvard University archives in Pusey, and my mother's family letters, I'd say, in the book, in the Schlesinger. So, which is a kind of weird experience for someone who's read so many other, letters of people not in my family in these archives. But anyway, just finding family stories verified in letters is very thrilling. As if I were writing about other people, but they're my people. So yeah, memory. I have a pretty good memory, but I've made some mistakes there too, and had to correct them.
Join the club.
Yeah. Hi, Pamela.
I have a question.
Here's the mic.
Thanks. I'm sorry I don't need it, but hi, I have a question. I'm intrigued with your description of finding objects as the impetus for the writing. And before I came tonight, I sort of grabbed this bag from the back of my closet, and I thought, oh my God, I gave this to my mother the last Valentine's Day I saw her.
Oh.
Yeah, and then I figured, I'm going to start to cry. And then I heard you talk about objects, so now I'm so intrigued because I don't have all these archival letters, and I have some photographs, but how do the objects jump out at you? Because our world is full of objects,
Yes.
and most of them are meaningless.
Well,
Except
maybe not.
My black bag.
Yeah, but there's a kind of a whole genre of writing going on. There's a book called The Bronte Cabinet about the Bronte sisters using, I forget if it's 8 or 9 different objects and deriving different stories about, I think, trying to remember what all those objects were, but I think one of them is the collar of the dog, of Emily Bronte's dog, and so the Bronte Cabinet, and there's the history of the world in 100 objects, or the history of the that kind of thing is going on a great deal. But I think we were talking about actually this beforehand when John Keg mentioned Merwin, the poet. I have another friend who's a poet and writes often about objects, and she thinks of it almost as a kind of meditative practice, and she did some studying up, I guess, on in religious orders, this might be something you would dedicate yourself to, meditating on an object. And that can become a prayer, which can, if you're a poet, become a poem. So when I first started teaching at Emerson, I wish I could remember the name of it. It'll probably come to me, and maybe Ivan knows. A little book called something like Things Matter, I don't know, but they had consulted artists and writers, and each page had a photo and a very short essay about that thing. And I had my students, come up with a thing. One of them was like the ignition key from a car or something like, or a sugar egg that somebody had saved from Easter for decades or something like that. So I think it's something that can be a very pleasurable thing to do. In fact, Elizabeth Bishop said she was very frustrated with her students' poetry that was all, I think, so confessional. She said, I'm going to take them to Woolworths. There was a Woolworths, maybe you remember, in Harvard Square, and have them pick a thing. I'll buy it for them, a roll of tape or whatever, and come back and write a poem about that thing. She was very much interested in the material, and that's sometimes she was sort of considered lesser because all she could do is describe things, but there's so much in description if you know how to do it. So anyway, we have one here and one there. I don't know. Oh,
Megan,
there.
what
Yeah.
will biographers do in a world without letters in the future?
Well, I dislike this question intensely, and many people ask it, and I just don't really have an answer. I'm sorry, but I guess you have to go through the, somehow archived emails. Some people do print out their emails. You have to interview people before they die, but I don't really have an answer to that. I'm sorry to say. Just keep writing about the 19th century or the early 20th, before the 80s, I guess. I have some wonderful letters that I saved from classmates, and it's interesting. I just was thinking how different the letter that my friend wrote to me over the summer of 1971 or 72, how different those letters are from any emails you would write, because everything she wanted to say to me was concentrated in that letter. What were we going to do in the fall? What was she doing in the summer? All these thoughts she had about the meaning of life. You just don't get emails like that because there's no occasion for them. And I think emails can be valuable, but they're not like that. So it's a loss. We had one here and one there. So.
I'm quick.
Oh, you're quick. A quick one.
Very quick.
Okay, a quick one here.
Your interesting explanation about being inspired by a little object brought to mind a story that a teacher told my class in elementary school about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow when he was a little boy. She had a great background on Longfellow. And from her reading, she said when he was in grade school, he was in class and everyone was supposed to write a composition and he wasn't writing. He was in freeze mode. And when the teacher asked him what was wrong, he said, I don't know what to write about. So she said, write about what you know. He said, I can't think of anything. And she said, an eggplant. Aren't they colorful? And he looked at her puzzled and said, all right. And he put an eggplant on top of his composition paper. And the more he pictured the color, the shape, the sun, the setting in nature, he wrote this lovely descriptive essay on an eggplant. And she was very pleased, and she said, you always write about what you know. And you just brought that happy memory to mind in elementary school.
Thank you. Well, you're bringing to mind one of my favorite little passages in one of the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, where Laura, we know or more or less, that she grew up to become a writer, and she's a good student, and she loves to read and recite and stuff like that, and she's in school. You all know the story, it's she's about to graduate, and she's suddenly told she has to write a composition. And she can't think how to do that, same kind of thing. So she goes to, and it has to be on, I think, aspiration or ambition, something like that, anyway. And so what does she do? She finally thinks, I'll go to the dictionary. And she looks up the dictionary definition, and then she uses that, and then she goes on from that to her own thoughts. And to me, that was a big lesson, that not to despair, and that you might have the tools at hand without even realizing it, and there's always some way you can get into your composition. So anyway, Tammy.
Hello. So I think you already know one of the questions that I'm going to ask. I just want to ask two quick ones.
Okay.
So Pasadena, right? So we also have another connection from Concord with Ellen Garrison,
Yes.
who is buried in Pasadena, or Altadena. Have you ever been to her grave, or did you know anything about her while you were growing up?
I have not been to Pasadena since 2017, and so I did not know about that then. I
don't think
learned
anybody
that
did.
Since.
Yeah.
Well, probably a few people did,
Or-
but
yeah.
but not many. So I have
few.
not been there, but I'm going to go in May, and actually my grandparents' house, a little bungalow that they built in 1923, survived the fire, even though it was right very near Eaton Canyon.
Yeah.
And I want to kind of go pay my respects. I just feel like since I wrote about it, I mean, that's where, I was going for the Sunday dinners.
Yeah.
And that's where the little yo-yo was that I have,
Yeah.
And it's been out of the family since the 80s, but I do want to go
Yeah.
see that. And, it just is a terrible tragedy.
Yeah.
But I was glad to have written what I did, when I did, and to have Altadena and Pasadena in this book.
Yeah, no, us too. And I hope that you continue to write about Altadena and Pasadena, and maybe even pass it on to your students, or find someone who would be an African-American woman, maybe, who would be interested in
Yeah.
doing some biography or more
Well,
research.
I think Octavia Butler needs, I don't
And-
think
yeah.
there is a biography of her. There's a wonderful collection of her interviews, which I found very helpful, and in which, not to reveal too much, but I have come to believe that it was my grandmother, the children's librarian, who introduced her to the library that became so formative in her life.
Awesome.
I know it was certainly the library, there are branch libraries in Pasadena, but it was a central library where my grandmother worked and told stories. So it was a storyteller, a librarian who was a storyteller who she remembers, and that was my grandmother in the 50s.
So wait, so my second question is
Yeah.
completely new topic, the Scarlet Letter. And I think that you guys were working on a project where this might be like the one, if not perfect, use of AI, like the one good, like healthy use of AI. Could you talk about that project a little bit and why you
I
chose?
think John is better at describing the rebind, but I did do a rebind edition of the Scarlet Letter, and what I did, I can't even really tell you, but I did it. You can explain briefly, because I know you're going to give a program on this
In
later.
May, I think,
In May, so
Alice.
you come and find it.
So what we do is we interview folks like Megan about their favorite books or the books that they find most meaningful, and many, many, many hours of commentary. And then the way that we use AI is to distribute it to readers, the commentary. We don't make a Megan bot or anything like that. We just distribute her verbatim commentary into conversations with readers. So you can ask Megan questions, you can ask Megan's commentary questions, and it will find the right part of commentary and bring it into conversation with you.
And apparently it's very successful. People love these. Mine is not out yet. When
It's
it will
going to
be.
be out next week, actually.
Oh, really?
So,
Wow.
so
So I have 3 books, I just have to tell you.
right.
I have this one, and then I co-edited with 2 other Fuller scholars, the Library of America collected, there it is, Margaret Fuller, collected Margaret Fuller writings. That came out last week, and now my rebind is coming out next week. I didn't know.
on Hawthorne.
On Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter. Oh, okay. Brad, do we have the...
When you spoke of your friend writing his memoirs and that his children didn't read them, it really.
Sorry, it hurts.
No, it hit home here for me, and it's the generational disconnect. When my mom had some boxes of things that her mother had put together of hers up in the shed, and I was raising 2 children and running a business, et cetera. And she said, take these. And I said, I'm building my house. I don't have any place to put them. And she threw them away. I know. And now I'm old. I want to see them. I want to reconnect to her. And I'm sort of in Concord to do that. And that generational disconnect is poignant and sad.
Well, this is Brad Johnston, who's a descendant of Nat Peabody, one of the Peabody sisters' brother. And we've known each other for a very long time since I was doing my research, and he was helpful to me. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for connecting me.
Yeah. Those things. A friend of mine told me even that there was maybe it was a family Bible or something like that. I don't know, some family thing that her mother was a big giver away, and the mother had given this to the town, this is in Evanston, Illinois, had given it to the Historical Society, and she was just so livid that her mother didn't think to offer it to her first before. I said, but you can go sit in the library, but it wasn't the same as she wanted the thing. She wanted to hold the thing, So maybe
One more question?
one last question? Or?
Not?
Go ahead.
Are you still writing poetry? And if so, are you publishing it? How can we read your poetry?
I did write one poem since 1978. And you can find that probably on my website. It was published by Plume Poetry, which is an online poetry website, and it's called Amaryllis. That came about in a really kind of magical way, also during the pandemic, that I had become friendly with Henri Cole, a wonderful poet who was writing about Elizabeth Bishop, some prose about Elizabeth Bishop, who was great, one of his favorite poets. And we'd been in touch because he was checking facts with me, and we became friendly. And then the pandemic came, and we were both quite isolated. He was in the South End, and I was in Belmont, but, might as well have been in the other side of the world. And he very kindly sent me an amaryllis bulb that winter, which surprised me, and we started talking. He had gotten one for himself, and we talked about how they were growing, and he said, you have to put a large stone in the pot as ballast once they get big, or they'll tip over. And I wrote back to him, well, now my, amaryllis is ballasted. And he wrote back and he said, I didn't know you could use that as a verb. And then the next day he said, I've written a poem and I used your word ballasted, although he didn't use it quite that way. But I said, will you send me the poem? So he sent me the poem, and then suddenly I just had this poem come to me about my amaryllis, as if I had to respond in kind, because I'm not a poet like Henri Cole at all, but I just suddenly felt like I had to respond with this poem, and I didn't know if it was much of a poem or not, but he liked it, other people liked it, and so there it is. But I haven't written any more. I also just want to acknowledge Laura Rockefeller here, who guided me to, this is a former student, and a writer and an actress, and someone who's lived a certain amount of her life in England. And she was going to London as I was doing the research for the Afterlives essay about Una Hawthorne, and I wanted to see Una Hawthorne's death certificate, and she looked it up for me. This kind of thing was easier to do long ago. You just wrote to people, and it would take a while, they write back. But now there are all these computer things, and Laura, I knew, could figure that out. So she got the death certificate, and then she also said, I'm not going to tell you the whole thing, but the color of Una's hair comes into this, the red hair, and she said, this reminds me a lot of Lizzie Siddall. And I said, Lizzie Siddall? Who's that? Anyway, Lizzie Siddall, it's a whole section about her, thanks to Laura. So, anyway. So thanks so much for coming, and I'll give you an errata slip if you buy a book. And I'll sign the books, too. So, thank you.